For those of you who don't know, this started out with one single text message between myself and Isaiah. It was one conversation that inspired two people who were daring to dream and no longer stay on the sidelines on these issues. Isaiah and I believe our superpower is connecting people and having a heart posture for service. And this was the birth of Equity Matters. We believed with the right tools and with leaders like you, we could build a virtual community and to establish meaningful connections with dynamic global leaders. We are committed to developing and sharing resources for real change, like this event you are attending today. And together we believe we can impact our world and our communities. And now a word from my co-host, Isaiah Samuel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Benindu Isaiah Samuel, and welcome to the Roundtable. We have several core beliefs at Equity Matters, and if you're here today, we believe that your voice matters, that your unique experiences matter, that your leadership matters, and that the world has a need that we can fulfill together. We all have an opportunity to be the change that we want to see in the world, and together we can serve as catalysts for changes in our workplaces, in our personal life, and in the world, one ripple at a time. We are here today to contribute to a living story, so please be present, be open, and enjoy it. With no further ado, I'd like to introduce our key speaker, Dr. Robert Strand. Dr. Strand is the Executive Director at the Center for Responsible Business and a member of the faculty at the Berkeley Haas School of Business. Go Bears. He also holds the title of Associate Professor with the Copenhagen Business School in Denmark. His research and teaching compares US and Nordic approaches to sustainable and socially responsible business and comparing capitalism in US and Nordic contexts. He is currently writing the book Sustainable Vikings, Nordic Lessons in Sustainable Capitalism and Building Resilient Societies. In all, I'm super excited about this conversation we're going to have today. Robert is really going to guide us and give us a touch of a base on leaders being able to lead and influence systematic change in order to build equitable society. So with no further ado, Robert, the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you so very much. And could I trouble you all? Would you unmute and just say hello, everyone, please? I'd love to hear your lovely voices.
Hi, Robert.
Hello.
Hello, Robert. All right.
Hello.
That gives me
Hello, Robert.
Put some wind in my sails here. I'm going to share. I'm going to use a presentation here just to guide a bit of the conversation. But then I really do intend for this to be a conversation. And could I just get a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Yeah. And do I sound okay? I mean, aside from my normal nasally voice, I can't do anything about that, but at least you can hear the words that I'm offering here. So I just want to first off say, Rashonda, Isaiah, thank you so very much for the opportunity to join you and as a community. I'm so impressed with what you're building and the opportunity to take part in here today. I'm very humbled. So thank you so very much. And I want to start with me, and I want to end with you all. And in 15 minutes, I want to tell you about my great-great-grandparents, tell you about the Nordics, talk about stakeholder and shareholder capitalism, how to be an anti-racist, and systems level change in 15 minutes. So that's a challenge to get through, but I'm going to hopefully seed a conversation. And then I want to say in advance here, my thanks to my good colleagues, Saren and Sarah, for taking part in this conversation here today. So let me start with me. And as Isaiah kindly offered, I am working on this book called Sustainable Vikings, Nordic Lessons in Sustainable Capitalism and Building Resilient Societies. And today's conversation is largely drawing from the final chapter. And that title of that chapter is Building Freer, Kinder, and Resilient Societies. And that's where I hope to land this. So I'm going to start with my great-great-grandparents. Now, I'd like to introduce you to Anna and Knut Strand, who came from Norway in 1861 to the United States of America. And they came with a desire to build a better life. The Nordic region at the time was in poverty. Poorest part of Europe, folks didn't have enough food to eat. And this is why my ancestors left. They came to the United States with this dream, this so-called American dream. And so I've had a long-standing orientation for family reasons, looking to the Nordic region. And it was during my MBA that the Nordics became something less of a historical context for me, something from my family, and more of modern day, because I continuously saw over and over and over again these sorts of measurements. This happens to be the Sustainable Development Goals Index, and it compares countries on a variety of environmental, social, and economic performance indicators. And the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Iceland, always seem to do comparatively really well in these things. And that perplexed me because my ancestors, just a few generations before, fled the region because it was so poor. And how was it? It just provoked my curiosity. How did this little tiny part of the world move forward, advance in a relatively short period of time? So that started an inquiry for me. And the Sustainable Development Goals are a very useful framework. The SDGs, as they're called, they encapsulate a broad range from economic indicators like number 8, decent work and economic growth, to health and social indicators, number 3, good health and well-being, number 10, reduced inequalities, number 5, gender equality, environmental factors, number 13, climate action, et cetera, a holistic range. And the Nordics are doing comparatively well when it comes to the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals. And we can encapsulate these 17 expansive goals down into one beautiful little lapel pin. And honestly, I feel naked if I'm not wearing this SDG lapel pin. It's a symbol. It's a symbol of all of our challenges that we face in this planet. Last year, the heads of the most influential corporations in the United States said we need to do something different. And the Business Roundtable, made up of CEOs including Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan and many others, said we need to have a new purpose of the corporation. We need to shift from a purpose that is focused on shareholder value maximization to one that serves stakeholders. An economy that serves all Americans is what they called for. And this was August of last year. Jamie Dimon, the American dream is alive, but fraying, is how he offered it. Now, I had the privilege, I was called, and the shareholder capitalism view of is much epitomized by this individual, Milton Friedman, who said the purpose of business is business, increase profits. And I had the privilege to be called to Congress to testify in December of last year, which feels like a millennia ago, but it was just less than a year ago, and offer some perspectives on this shift from shareholder capitalism to this idea of stakeholder capitalism. And there you can see I've got my lapel pin that I was wearing proudly, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I raised a thought experiment in my testimony because I asked the question about Patagonia. Patagonia, this California-based company, many herald as a champion of the stakeholder view of the firm, and I have a great deal of respect for Patagonia. And why is it called a champion of stakeholder view of the firm? Well, in part because one of its key stakeholders, its employees, Patagonia is considered a responsible company because its employees have access to good health care, to paid parental leaves, to good quality childcare. And I raised a question. I said, is this the view? Is this how we achieve stakeholder capitalism? That we want to make every company look like Patagonia? And then I asked another question that was, what about the folks that don't get to work for Patagonia? 50% of folks in the United States achieve their health care through their employer. What about the other 50%? And started raising some questions about this. If this is the wisest place to put these responsibilities, these burdens for stakeholders to achieve this stakeholder view of capitalism. And I was met in response by policymaker, "I'm concerned you're against capitalism," is a direct quote by one of the Congress people in response to my testimony. Okay, try to shift attention toward this area that is very capitalistic. In fact, the home of stakeholder capitalism, the Nordic region. In fact, the first time the word stakeholder was ever put in print was in the Nordic region in a Swedish book, translated into English in the 1960s. And the American dream, this idea of the American dream that Jamie Dimon has concerns is fraying. Well, the Prime Minister of Finland last year, a direct quote, "The American dream can be best achieved in the Nordic countries, where every child, no matter their background or the background of their families, can become anything." And indeed, when we look at the American Dream Index, this is a social mobility index, the Nordic countries, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And America is not doing so well when it comes to the American Dream Index. Number 27. This idea of American dream, social mobility, you can do anything that you want, just put in the hard work. It's less the case in America than it is in the Nordic countries. Now, I have had this interest in the Nordics, but a conversation from 2 years ago, an individual that many of us know and love, who I'm proud and grateful to see has joined us today, Marco, a leader at Haas, the School of Business. Had a great conversation with him where we got to the point of asking purpose and purpose of life. And Marco's response to what is the purpose of life was to serve others. And my response is to love and to be loved. And I came to a realization over that particular lunch with Marco that one day, that this is why I'm so drawn to the Nordic region. It's not because of the Nordic people. I love so many good folks from the Nordics. I named my youngest son Jonas after a wonderful Danish person. But I love a lot of people in America too, Marco very much included. It's not the people, but it's the systems that I've seen put in place in a Nordic context that actually enable folks to be more likely to be able to pursue their purpose. They're not inhibited by fear and anxiety of losing healthcare or not having access or being thrown into the streets. More likely to be able to pursue your purpose. Time, the precious element of time. I saw work-life balance in the Nordic region that I didn't see in the United States. The systems is what I love from the Nordic region, and think we can learn some lessons here in the States. And that brings, when we talk about Ibram X. Kendi and how to be an anti-racist. Creating a more equitable society is in white American self-interest. And Kendi says, for the vast majority of Americans, being anti-racist or creating more equitable society is actually in the self-interest. White Americans are constantly thinking about what they would lose with a radical renovation of this country's policies, as opposed to what they would gain. So they are quick to compare themselves to people of color, as opposed to comparing themselves to what people of other Western democracies have, like the Nordic region. Then the question is, why don't we have paid family leaves in the US? Dr. Kendi asks. Why doesn't everyone have access to free healthcare? Why is there so much income inequality? And one of the reasons you can point to is racism and people being constantly manipulated to support policies and policymakers against their own self-interest. We are advocating against our own self-interest. Policymakers like the congressperson that I shared before, I think that's against capitalism. 2 days ago, Harvard Business Review, go read this. Professor Katie Collins, a wonderful academic and a wonderful human being. Free markets failed US working parents. New federal policies for paid leave, quality and affordable childcare, fair work schedules, and living wages are more important than ever. Indeed, she's right. In this book, Making Motherhood Work is an excellent one. Finland is a capitalist paradise. Talking about, in just December of this last year, a new Partanen. Nordic societies have demanded that their governments provide high-quality public services for all citizens. And here is, I want to work this into the American discussion. It liberates business to focus on what they do best. Business in the Nordic context is not burdened with these benefits as Patagonia is in the United States. And in fact, the far right-wing, most conservative folks are the greatest champions of the policies of paid parental leaves, of healthcare, of good quality, affordable childcare in the Nordic region, because those folks recognize it enables business to do what business can do best. And when business can pursue and do what it does best, you have a robust economy, and then you can pay for those services much more efficiently. So that brings us here full circle. And I want to end on this systems level change, this idea of reimagining the role of business leaders. Where does this leave us? So here is my takeaway and what I'd like to see in our conversation. For us as business leaders, to think in terms of systems. I came to discuss issues of ethics from an individualistic lens and then an organizational lens. What should I do as an individual leader to help those individuals around me? And what can my company do? And I've increasingly realized we need business leaders to step up to a higher order level, to consider at a societal level. That takes us to the ideas of policy. Policies are systems for society. So I challenge each of us to ask the question, which policy will you champion? Paid parental leaves, affordable quality childcare, universal healthcare, climate action, voter expansion, universal education? Which are you going to champion as a business leader? And a good exercise that you can do to try to orient yourself, and that is consider the SDGs. Which SDG speaks to you? I'm drawn to number 4, quality education, and number 10, reduced inequalities. Those speak to me. So I'm committed to champion policies to expand education for all. And there I draw a lesson here also from the Nordics again. Because when we look back at my impoverished great-great-grandparents, even in poverty, Norway and the other Nordic countries at that time, what little resources they had, they invested in education. Access to education for everyone. That has paid off incredible dividends over time by having a more robust society, a more engaged society, and some of the highest levels of participation from a democratic standpoint, highest voter turnouts, for example, part of the world. And largely, you can look back and say strong, robust education. Business leaders, we need to consider to move from ideas of lobbying, so just in your own self-interest of your company, to smart policy. And that's the challenge. And I leave with American spoken word artist Gil Scott-Heron, who's known for this idea, this quote, "The revolution will not be televised." And I saw an interview once with Gil Scott-Heron, who passed away a couple years ago. I saw an interview with him where he was asked about, what do you mean by that? What is the revolution will not be televised? What did that mean? And he said, the revolution that's of the greatest importance is not one that anybody can see. It's the one that occurs in your mind. When you recognize the system that you're part of, its problems, its flaws, and you set upon the task of fixing it. And that's what my experience in the Nordic countries did for me. It revolutionized my American mind. I would have thought ideas like that congressperson, that sounds anti-capitalistic. But now we flip it on its head. And I would suggest that it's up to us business leaders who happen to be in positions of power to use that powerful platform to advocate for policy that works for more of us. And I'd say it's in our own self-interest to do so also. Thank you.
Wow. I have a page full of notes, Robert, from this, and I was not sure how you were going to unpack such a big topic in 17 minutes. And I was going over this with Isaiah, and he goes, "Don't worry, he's a professional, and I trust him." And sure enough, you did it all the way down to the quote, the revolution will not be televised. I never knew what that meant. Of course, it always sounds cool and like different songs I've heard. And then policies are systems, and what systems are we going to champion? I know that this is we're going to get started with some questions and talking to the panel, but I'm so excited for this. So yeah, amazing. Really, really great. And
that's very kind of you to say, Roshana. Thank you.
I know that people are going to start entering and questions into the chat. For those of you who are not familiar with the structure that Isaiah and I have, we will start by introducing the panel and unpacking some questions that were sent to us ahead of time. And then once that is, we usually take about 10, 15 minutes on that. And then you can enter in questions into the chat or unmute yourself. And this is about connecting, this is about community, this is about having a conversation, and we will open it up to the entire audience. So let's get started.
And just want to add in, I know some questions already coming into the chat. Continue to throw those in there, and let's make this as interactive as we can. As we're going through the panel questions as well, if you want to deviate or you want to step in and ask any questions, feel free to do so. Let's get everybody involved and move this forward.
Really good. So we'd like to introduce both Sarah and Saren. I thought I was going to get that all mixed up, but I nailed it. And we'll start with an introduction. Saren, please tell us who you are and how you're joining us today. And then Sarah, if you can also give an introduction afterwards about who you are.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm Saren Pendleton-Knoll. I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Responsible Business. I work alongside Robert every day. I primarily oversee our sustainable innovation work, looking at how companies can reimagine their business operations to drive towards sustainability, to drive towards the UN SDGs. Prior to that, I was overseeing our sustainable and impact investing program, looking at how capital can be reimagined for community impact. Before being at Haas, I spent 5 years in community services and social work and working directly with communities. So my kind of passion lies at the intersection between business and achieving community impact. I also work on campus advocating for a paid parental leave, because if you didn't know, UC Berkeley doesn't have it. So that's something I've been working very closely with campus on trying to achieve.
Really good. Thank
She's
you.
also a superstar mom. To throw that out.
Oh yeah, I have 2 kids. Didn't put that in my intro.
Really
And hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Hilmer. It's so great to be here with this group today. I'm an evening and weekend MBA student at UC Berkeley Haas, and I'm also a student advisory board member for the Center for Responsible Business. So I work closely with Saren and Robert on just really unpacking these issues on a weekly basis. I have a full-time job at Intuit, where I run the corporate responsibility and DEI communications programs. So I'm helping build kind of brand image and thought leadership for the company around those key issues. Really keen to jump into conversation about some of the questions that were coming in around genuine change. And you know, if companies are really seeing it happen in their workplaces, and I can talk all about that. Excited to continue the conversation today.
Thank you. Really good. And of course, part of the panel is Dr. Robert Strand. And Isaiah, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so we really appreciate everybody throwing in questions into the registration document, and super excited to get kicked off. So first question we have here from the community is, do you think business leaders are interested in genuine change, or is it performative to improve public image?
So I think we're seeing a real revolution in how businesses communicate, largely driven by a really crowded media landscape. So just thinking about examples, you know, in recent months, voting, Black Lives Matter movement, even COVID, it's impossible to create a brand for a business without thinking about those moments in time. And so I think there's some interesting examples of brands that are jumping into those conversations that you would just think it's not their place. So big beer companies, for example, leaders from those companies taking a stance on racial justice. It feels a little off, but I think from my perspective as a brand communicator, your brand can't show up if you're not in those conversations. So I think to really answer this question, we have to uncover a bit and figure out if there's actual action behind what brands are putting out there and what leaders are saying. So I think being a little skeptical is entirely appropriate. I think where we see business leaders really being genuine here is when they're repeatedly talking about an issue, even when it's not the darling of the media at the moment. So Mark Benioff talking about homelessness in San Francisco, it is his ongoing passion and something that you can tell he's very genuine about, because it's not just happening at the time of big legislation, but he's always out there advocating for it and has actually created policies within Salesforce and influenced legislation outside of Salesforce to really create systemic change in that area. And I think the same goes, now we're seeing this resurgence around what was happening in May and June with media around Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd killing. I mean, the businesses and the leaders that are really authentic about these big issues are the ones that are still talking about it. The ones that are talking about the actions that they're taking. There was just an article that Intuit was included in today, actually, in Bloomberg, talking about here are the S&P 500 returns on the businesses that have since hired a Black person on their board, since from May until now. And it's those sort of actions behind spoken word that I think really brings a genuine perspective out from leaders. And I think that's what we should be evaluating is there those actions behind the words that they're saying?
I would echo Sarah's statement wholeheartedly. And having been in a position now where we partner a lot at our center with a number of different companies who come to us with these pressing social sustainability issues and need help enacting that, both from faculty research side and students working hands on deck on it. I think where we're seeing a bit of that disconnect can happen when the C-suite is not connecting with their employees on that action. So employees have been living, breathing a lot of these issues for their whole lives in their workplace and in their personal. And as we're seeing kind of these big sweeping statements that are coming out at the corporate level, oftentimes there is not that connection back to the employees that have been working on the ground in that issue. And that's where I see when there is movement forward is the acknowledgement of, here's our game plan, here's moving forward. Let's tap into the talent that's been working on these issues and acknowledging that, as opposed to kind of the traditional white savior complex of a C-suite trying to solve it themselves. And I think that's where we're seeing where, as Sarah said, like, what is you've been championing a long time? If you are new to this table, let's acknowledge where you have gaps and lack of knowledge, and who are the people who have that knowledge that you can learn from.
That's really good. Robert, I have a question here. Did you want to add to anything to that? You're good? I have a question that came in as well, and how to identify where systems change is needed and what role can I serve to be a catalyst for change? And I know you mentioned that in the presentation. Do you mind giving it a first unpacking for folks who are actually looking for how do you take it to this next step? We're having this dynamic conversation, but the action.
Yeah, it's a great question, actually, and it connects. I saw that Margot asked as far as elements of Nordic governance that allow positive policies, and there's a bit of a connection here. And my way background is as an industrial engineer, and that is efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. I actually, when thinking about where are there systems level, where is it necessary? I think first, I often think through the lens of efficiency. Where is something most efficiently done? So, and that brings me to why the Nordic region has been able to achieve such strong results as they have, is that they've never lost sight of efficiency. And I'll say, I think that there's a fear amongst, for example, that the congressperson who challenged me on capitalism, and it was a failure on my own part not to articulate this, that what I'm talking about is a bunch of socialistic sort of like, let's forget about business having to make profits completely and let's just give everybody free money sort of discussions. This we're talking about efficiency. And when we look at, for example, administration of healthcare in the United States, we spend 19% of our GDP on healthcare. In Denmark, they spend 11% of their GDP on healthcare. Now, we aren't getting any better outcomes as a result of that. And so what they've done in the Nordic countries is they collect data and they pragmatically make decisions to try to drive efficiencies and use free markets where they work really well and don't use them where they don't work well. And it turns out that in distribution of healthcare, it turns out that that's not a very efficient allocation. And so I start through the lens of efficiency. How can we do this well? So that takes me to systems thinking, because in order to think about efficiency, just like when I was an industrial engineer on a manufacturing floor, if I just went right to one piece of equipment and said, I'm going to optimize that piece of equipment, and that is my success criteria, without stepping back and looking at the overall flow and how things worked, I wouldn't get the outcomes that we desire. So it's being able to go in close and then step back and look at an overall whole. And here's where folks in design thinking, oh, they're so helpful for us because they can help us map an overall picture of things. And then we can figure out, where am I going to focus? And that brings us back then to the individual. Each of us, we come alive in different areas. And so how is it that you can take a step back, look at the overall system, and then say, where can I contribute most? I come alive right there. I come alive in education, that part of the overall system. I'm going to focus on that. And that's the kind of leader that I think that we need, is to be able to see the full picture and then be able to go in and see, where can I make a difference? And where should my company make a difference?
That's really good. I like it when you bring it back down, because one of the things that we hear all the time in our surveys is people are wanting, how do I apply this to myself and then push it out? And of course, Isaiah and I are all about the ripple effects that a person can create when you gain knowledge that you should do something with it, both personal, your work, and the world. So we always love to circle back to what that is. Sarah, would you like to add anything to that question? And I can read it again if you like.
I think I would just add and speak to the importance of the system level thinking on this. That even though we're kind of individuals at companies and corporations, we're all operating within a system, and having that knowledge and exposure to where you as a company can collaborate with other companies on a goal outside of yourselves. That's where we're going to get the best outcomes, and not going it alone as an individual, as a company.
It's really good. Awesome.
Excellent. So the next question that we have here, I know we're talking a lot about looking at the big picture and trying to motivate that change. So the question here is, what can actually be the triggers that motivate business leaders to take those actionable steps? And on the flip side, what are some of the barriers to systems change?
I mean, from a negative side, negative press coverage and stakeholder demand, I would say, is a huge driver, as well as employee buy-in. So if your employees at a company are demanding a specific change and you're having mass demand for it, that's where we're seeing companies shift, right? It's this collective, it's beyond an individual, but if it's you have no longer have buy-in from your consumers or your employees, you as a company cannot operate. So making sure that there is that collective voice raising is still a very effective strategy for a company for making that change.
I'd like to echo that. Sarah, I think, raises a really good point. I think one of the greatest, if not the greatest driver that I see for, and let's say the purpose-driven organizations. I think this idea of purpose, it's talent. And I mean, I have the privilege to work, closely with Sarah, for example, one of our wonderful students at Berkeley Haas, and talent desires purpose. And when I'm having conversations with the most senior executive of some old school company, and typically it's a male, typically, and typically a white male, it's been. These discussions, if I raise and talk about the importance of purpose and things like this, it doesn't always resonate with. But when I say, do you want to get the best talent? Do you want talent to come and actually work with the organization? Then they start realizing, and to see the shift of actually talent demanding purpose, demanding, and the research is in it. It's very clear. Money is a motivator. You have to pay people enough money. But people demand enough money to take the issue of money off the table. Beyond that, purpose is the motivator. So you have to pay people enough money where they're not thinking about the money. And this goes for knowledge workers. Beyond that, it's purpose. And that's where I'm drawn to the SDGs, because they are a great purpose compass. And organizations that can take this kind of outside-in perspective, look at the real challenges, the problems of the world, and then walk back to say how they as an organization and how individuals within that organization are going to connect to it. Those are organizations that come alive, that flourish, and that talent wants to be part of.
Really good.
One quick thing to add, just as a barrier, many of these big system change ideas have become political topics within businesses. And I mean, even at Intuit, we experience this all the time. You know, there's a huge backlash when we announce that we're adding diversity to the board, or that we have hired a an equity leader who is a person of color. And there's actual, whether it's on Blind as a platform or it's actually coming into our leaders, every time there's backlash of why is the business prioritizing this. And I think there's some really prominent examples, Intuit included, of just taking a stance for what you believe in as a company. And I mean, it's way easier said than done. A great example of it is Expensify. The CEO sent a letter to all of their customers encouraging them to vote a particular way and basically explaining that democracy was at stake. And I think there are these key cornerstone issues that brands and the leaderships of teams just have to decide, is it something we stand for? Is it something we don't stand for? And even if you're going to lose customers or employees over it, at the end of the day, if it's part of your value set, I think corporations have a really unique opportunity at this point in time in the US to take a stance for what they believe in and make sure it's aligned to their values, but just really put their stance out there.
I would echo that and tie that to also, and Robert, I know you get this question a lot as well, in terms of the rise that we're seeing in white nationalism in Europe, in the Nordic regions, in the United States, and when that's embedded into our government systems and our policies, where there is that push and pull of, if we're having our systems embedded in government as opposed to business, but then those governments are being infiltrated by extremisms in ways that do not value human life equally. What's the role of business in that situation? And when is there that push and pull and that important conversation where business needs to step up, government needs to step up, and how do you balance those two?
And if I could I draw, and I saw a really important question along those lines, and perhaps, Saren, you were inspired by, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Amel, poses a really important question here. And do you mind, Rashonda, Isaiah, is it okay if I ask if Amel's comfortable?
Yeah, let's go ahead and bring in the audience and unmute yourself. And Amel, if you want to actually interact with Dr. Robert Strand, then go for it. Let's ask your question and let's go from there.
And if I could just, Robert,
okay, Robert.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm Armel. You can say it Armel in French. If you speak French, it's Armel.
Je parle un petit peu de français.
Okay, c'est bien. So would you like me to ask the question again?
If you'd be so kind, please.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, especially being a non-immigrant myself in the US, and I just finished my master's, and I'm thinking about where to go next. And I hear what you're saying, and I've seen the news, I've been keeping up with Nordic countries and looking at it like, oh, maybe that's where I should be going if I want equality in the workspace as a woman and more opportunities. And I was just thinking, are these countries, first of all, presenting themselves as safe havens for people of color, of diverse backgrounds? And what's the current environment for them when it comes to immigration, especially if you see the images from France or Italy and you see them turning away immigrants from North Africa and Syria? Are these Nordic countries doing a better job of accepting these immigrants, given that they have this wonderful system and policies that promote diversity?
Yeah, and thank you, Armel, very much. It's a couple of reflections on it, and Saren raised a good point here, is that I wish there was a utopia on this planet. I wish there was a place where racists weren't running free, and I regret to say that that's not the case in the Nordic region, that they have just as many racist idiots running around in Scandinavia as we do here in the United States. Where there is a difference, however, is that a racist idiot in the United States can prevent you from getting a job, and then by extension of that, prevent you from also getting health care and paid parental leaves and a whole host of social security systems. If one is a citizen in a Nordic country, a racist idiot could prevent you from getting a job, but these other systems are in place. So there's less discretion to exercise hurt upon others. Now, when it comes to folks, immigrants coming to the Nordic region, they have some incredible challenges. And there's been some really ugly things that you could see across the countries. And there's been some differences within Nordic countries on how they've responded. So Sweden, in the Syrian crisis, for example, opened up and took more immigrants on a per capita basis than anybody in Europe, and only Germany on an absolute basis. And Germany's a lot bigger than Sweden. But then we saw some really ugliness because there was not the engagement, there wasn't the integration with, Swedish society, and this uprising of right-wing Swedish nationalists. And we see this in Sweden, we see it in Denmark, we see it in the United States. And so it's only more recently that I'm reflecting upon the wonderful experience that I had in the Nordic context. And I also happen to be a tall white guy. And for me to decouple and say that didn't have anything to do with it, where I might have been received differently than somebody who has a different skin color than me, would be naive of me to say. So I can speak to the systems in place. I see there's such opportunity for us to implement and learn from in the United States. But I cannot say that I've found a place on this planet yet that's going to respond to the important challenges that you've raised.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
I saw a question in from Ifani.
Ifani, are you on?
I am on.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm having like network difficulties.
No worries.
So-
Did you want to ask your question, Ifani, so we can unpack?
Yeah, sure. Yes. So my first question was around what Robert and Sarah and Saren have come across, particularly in Scandinavia, as best practices for internal champions to gain buy-in from, top level decision makers and just generally from other team members when it comes to driving systems level changes that are typically costly or tedious. Because everybody just wants to do their job, and why should we take on this extra action and take on this? Why does this matter to me? Why does it matter to the company? How do we earn from this? So that's my question.
In fact, I think it's a great question. And actually, it speaks to a burden that we have here in the United States that I would suggest we have to take on, because in a Nordic context where these big systems level issues like healthcare, like childcare, et cetera, are provided from a different entity than the company, they're provided at the state, and they're provided efficiently, and they have to be, otherwise it would all fall apart. But they're provided by the state. So folks inside the company, what they're focused on is doing good business, is making good products, creating value for their stakeholders, and reaping a profit. And I think that we have, because we have taken a different approach in the United States, and I don't think it was necessarily by design, that we said, hey, let's tie our healthcare to our employment. And this is something that was, or let's provide these things as benefits, as we call them in the United States. I actually think now we have a responsibility, business leaders in the United States, to reimagine the systems that we have in place and actually pull apart and say, this doesn't make sense at the company level. Why should a company take on these things that are actually more efficiently potentially allocated and more equitably allocated elsewhere in society? So I actually think this is an additional burden that we have as business leaders in the United States to champion for change. And here's why: when Jamie Dimon and these very prominent CEOs say we need to shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, I'll take them at their word that they're sincere about it. But what I have not seen since that moment in time in August last year, I haven't seen any substantive moves that would actually move us more toward a stakeholder variety of capitalism. And one of my greatest concerns we have in the United States is this incredible concentration of power that we have. And with folks like Jamie Dimon, and I haven't seen any steps from corporate governance or other things to try to, how do we disperse power more consistent with the ideals of democracy? And so that's a challenge that we have to take on as business leaders to try to address.
Oh my God. We also have Karen Bradford, who has a question or a comment. Karen, are you on the call?
am. Hello. I
Hi.
just was agreeing with what Robert had said earlier, and in response to Armel's, comment, wondering about where is it that you could go in order to maybe have an easier time and not deal with racists. And my experience in my life has been that racists have luggage. I mean, they travel, their kids go to college, they get job offers. It's not like they're puddled, somewhere. So it's one of those things that you must be constantly sort of aware and ready to engage. But I love that with the policies and systems in place so that everyone has this opportunity, regardless of what that individual may do to try to stop or halt or cause you to not thrive, that you at least have a chance of being able to do that. And I think that's key. And it's something that in America, we really have not tackled the systems. We've tackled the conversations individually. We've then puddled where we think racists are, which I think has done us a great disservice. And not really taking it as a whole. If you're on the earth, you're going to find people who have something against you, regardless of what that is. Mm-hmm. The thing is, what do you do? What systems do you have in place that's for the benefit of all? What do you have in place? Whether it's why we don't have really good parental leave care, I have no idea, because it's not like children aren't being born every day. They're not going to stop. So what do you think is going to happen? Who do you think is going to do all that work? It just doesn't make any sense, right? So there must be a reason. There's a systemic reason. And it is exactly the way to attack it is in a systemic way. So I love the energy around these conversations, and the people on the call, you have the power and the voice to do that. And that's just keep having the conversation. That's what I want to say. You guys are doing great work, and Isaiah and Rashonda, this is just amazing. Just keep doing the work and keep having the conversations and keep asking why. And I think eventually we'll get there.
May I offer a reflection?
Please.
On there, and Karen, thank you so much. And let me say, here's a reflection also, just of my own personal reflection on where I feel maybe I have been able to move to a place where I can be of greater potential service and impact in these discussions of racism, et cetera. And there's something when somebody like me can move from discussions of racism, and where my initial reaction is, how do I prove that I'm not racist? Like, to where I can move to actually say, let's look at the systems and the structures. And how, for me, it was actually looking back at my ancestors, my great-great-grandparents. Anna and Knut Strand, who you met, came in 1861 to the States. And the stories told of them are of fortitude and strength. And they had to put up with a lot, and they built a life that now I'm benefiting from. Mm-hmm. And that's a truth. And I can hold on to that truth and be proud of that. And they came at 1861. And in 1862, my ancestor took advantage of the Homestead Act and got a property for himself. And it's only now that I start looking and considering questions of whiteness and how it was because of his whiteness. And he wasn't white in Norway, but when he came to the United States of America, Knut Strand was white. And now Knut Strand had access to things and property that he didn't have before. And when I can see it through the lens of whiteness and these structures that have been put in place, I can say, I'm proud of my ancestors for their hard work, yes, and they benefited so much from property rights that have extended through. And I have a love for the University of California, Berkeley. I believe it's an American dream factory. That can be true. And that land from a land grant institution was taken from Native population. That can be true also. And a thing that I think why I'm also drawn to the Nordic region is the level of education encourages critical thought and encourages pluralistic thought, that multiple things can be true, there can be tensions, and maybe we can't reconcile these things into one absolute truth. And I find in the United States, because of our, I don't know what it is, but a desire for a simple narrative, we say, I can't listen to that stuff. Just give me the heroic, ancestor narrative. And I feel a need to be able to hold on to multiple truths and tell that story. And when I was able to move to this idea of structures and systems, all of a sudden, my worst petty self and self-defensive person I could push that aside because it wasn't me trying to prove how not racist I am. I'm trying to understand the overall systems. And that was strangely freeing in a way. And I think much more hopefully constructive.
Oh, I love that. That is so true, Robert. And can I just say just one more thing? And thinking about the ancestors and thinking about how we got here. Living in the and has actually become our motto in our family this year. Live in the and, right? It doesn't have to be this or that all the time, right? You get stuck when it's this or that, right? You can't breathe when it's this or that, right? Deal with the and, right? And as we were talking about that and looking back, I made a statement for my own children, and I'm a very old woman. We won't get into how old, but very old, but not that old. We have 5 kids, we have 9 grandkids, and I was getting ready to walk on the stage at NASA in February. We're getting ready to do a talk, and I looked to my deputy center director. We're of a similar age, and the person who was talking was getting ready to talk on the law and Black history and civil rights, what have you. And I said, she said, oh, this is very important. I said, yes, it is. And I said, I was a woman who was born without the right to vote. And she just looked at me like, what? I said, yeah, this is really important to me because I wasn't born in this country with the right to vote. And she looked at me and she said, well, that can't be. I said, aren't we the same age? Ish. She said, oh my gosh. She said, Karen Bradford, I never in my life, it didn't occur, you just don't think. So I thought, well, if she doesn't know, I wonder if my children know that. So I went home and I said, did you know your dad and I were born without the right to vote? And they just said, no, that can't be right. I said, well, check the history, look at the numbers, the dates are pretty clear. I look like I'm 1,000 years old. I'm not, but that's where we are. And do you know it completely changed the conversation around voting in our family?
Amazing.
It changed the entire conversation around using your voice because they realized they have children of their own and they themselves were one generation away from not having that right and having the ability to change systems and policies in America today. That it wasn't something their great grandparents didn't have. It was something their own mother and father didn't have. And you just don't think about it, right? So and they were appalled that there were still people alive walking on the planet today who were born without that right. It just never occurred to them. So conversations around systems and policies and how do you change it, it's important. And the tie-in with ancestry is important. I really do appreciate, what you're bringing to the table here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Whoa, Karen, you just blew up the chat box with that story. Thank you so much for sharing that. I almost have tears just even thinking about I think we don't always think about these things. It's part of the conversation, but when you see a face to a story or an event, it takes it to a whole nother level. That was so powerful. Thank you for sharing that with all of us. Woof. The other person that had a question in the chat was Troy Taylor. You had a question. Do you want to share?
Yeah, that's fine. Robert, my question was, you said it in the beginning, the system change, it's such a macro concept, it's like a reorganization of the way people think or governments or companies approach things. But my question, to be more exact, was what are you thinking in terms of what is the process proposed for system changes in companies? Like, what would be that process?
I think it starts with me. It starts with you. It starts with each of us to say, what is one policy measure that you feel needs to be put in place or changed? And for me, for example, paid parental leave. That's one that I'm so committed that paid parental leave, we need to put that in place in the United States of America. And so many inequality issues, et cetera. And also from a policy perspective, it can be implemented. Also thinking about that's something that could be actually implemented. But that I come alive when I think about that for a number of reasons. And for what you come alive with. And this is, I actually would suggest starting personally before the company, because typically we've looked at policy, what should my company be involved in? And it immediately goes to lobbying sort of efforts. And so for us to think, like, affordable quality childcare, and Katie Collins had a number of them there. Living wages, fair scheduling for folks. So for us each to, I guess it's a call for more of us in the business community to get more engaged with policy. And I could just reflect on my own, unless one is in a public affairs role in companies. I mean, I personally never thought about policy when I was working 10 years in corporate America. I didn't think once about it. And I feel ashamed to admit that. And I think that needs to change.
I would echo on that, Robert, too, including in that also kind of the impact assessment, data assessment that goes along with that. I think there can be a lot of policies put into place, both at businesses and at governments, that do not have the evaluation after the fact to measure those unintended consequences. So there can be the design of this perfect solution that has massively inequitable outcomes. And without capturing the data of that, without doing robust studies, that's not captured. And I think kind of we're seeing that out of some of the immigration initiatives that have happened out of governments. We're seeing that as we're looking towards housing building, where you can see that at any level. And so that's just kind of a push on, are you collecting the right data? Are you doing data collection? How are you measuring that? And you're making sure the right voices are in the room as you're designing these policies, so that it's not just disproportionately lifting up some in that effort. I will just add that I got a private question that I think can tack onto this that I wanted to share to everyone. And this was to Sarah and Robert and myself as well, was if we could speak more about some examples of how white majority populations or entrenched powers actually benefit from more equitable societies as well.
What I've seen in the Nordic context, when you have a more educated, wider populace, the societies themselves actually are more efficient. It's this, the economists in the United States, I think, have unnecessarily teed up this idea of efficiency goes against equality and equity issues. And Arthur Okun, who is the chief economic advisor for Johnson many, many moons ago, wrote a book, Equality and Efficiency, The Great Trade-Off. And he characterized how these things are actually opposition. And he used a metaphor within the book that has become famous across economists, and it's called the leaky bucket metaphor. And the leaky bucket metaphor says that if you want to address issues of inequality, well, you could take a bucket of water from the efficiency spout and you take it over to the folks that don't have and you pour it. But it's leaky. You're going to lose some along the way. And that metaphor, I think, is rotten. I would suggest that we need metaphors of the efficient hand pump. Because what we need to do is, rather than think about equality issues as we need to solve it by giving folks things, what we need to do is actually create a society where folks have equality of opportunity and they have access to things like education. And here we've seen, and the Nordics have proven it out, that by focusing on having equality of opportunity, so access to education, access to healthcare, you actually can create a society that is more efficient overall in the long run. And I think that we too often think about leaky buckets here in the United States when we think about addressing issues of inequality.
I think it's also worth pointing out that historically, as companies have rolled out their diversity initiatives, as governments have rolled out initiatives, that it's disproportionately benefited white women. And as we're thinking through like increasing board diversity, it checks the box if you then flip over to all women, but those end up being all white women. And if we're looking at all these different policies that we're designing for, quote, diversity or designing for equity, but not looking at the subsets within that, that it ends up benefiting the same types of people over and over again. So I think as we're thinking through these policies, as we're thinking through the systemic change, if we design, innovate, enact policies that's benefiting the most marginalized, that's going to uplift everybody. So if we're taking the most marginalized in our community, designing systems for them, designing policies for that person in mind, that's going to have an upstream effect to uplift everybody. But if we're looking baseline, we're just going to continue to benefit white women and continue to benefit those that already have significant advantages.
That's really good.
I know Karthik has a question here in the chat regarding systems change and an evolving economic landscape. Karthik, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, this is so far been an amazing conversation, and this is slightly different in theme. So I do not want to diverge too far from the current conversation. But one of the things that I was thinking about, particularly in the context of having recently voted on Prop 22, is we're talking about system change, but the system itself is changing. So systemically, we want to change and make improvements to accessibility, bringing equity to the forefront, responsibility. And through the course of this, models are also evolving, so to speak, right? Like, the gig economy is one example through this within that. And, part of me wants to think they're all independent. But another part of me is if there were, accessibility to, say, healthcare or paternal leave or maternal leave, etc., some may not be as complicated to untether as the other. So my question is not just an answer on what is the right thing to do, as opposed to a framework to think about. How do you think about some of these evolving capabilities, and how do you think about systemic change to make it more equitable as these capabilities evolve?
Just one quick response that I'm drawn to is how can we help establish systems that enable this growth mindset, where rather than folks, for example, in an economy worried about what they're going to lose, clinging to a job, how do we actually make it where folks are more enabled and feel like they have the confidence that there will be another job there, and you actually create a more flexible labor market? And in a Nordic context, that's described as flex security. And I saw a very, if you have a little time to kill and an interest, a documentary from the 2008, and it's called The Price of a Paycheck is the name of it. And they did a nice documentary, and it was Electrolux, which was a Swedish company, and it was shutting down a shop in Sweden and it's shutting down in Michigan, and it was moving its assembly to China. And they interviewed the folks at the Michigan shop and they interviewed the folks at the Swedish shop. And the difference in mindset, these are people of same jobs, but the folks in Sweden had been job training. They weren't going to lose their health care. They weren't going to, lose their houses. And they were talking about the next job that they were going to have. There was a certain kind of growth mindset confidence. The folks in the Michigan shop, alcoholism was on the rise. Folks were getting chronic pains. Anxiety levels were going through the roof. They didn't see another option. So when I think about issues like gig economy and all these sorts of things, how do we actually make it where we can have, in an American context, we have some real problems with the gig economy, but there are some real benefits in flexibility and having a nimble workforce. How do we take the good, enable flexibility and mitigate against that harm? Folks that don't have any safety net. An Uber driver who's relying upon that wage in the United States and then COVID hits, these folks just fall through the floor. That wasn't the case in Denmark, for example. So I see this kind of systems as enabling a growth mindset at an overall societal level.
Extremely useful. Thank you.
We have one question here that came from the registration. What role does societal culture play in the adoption of systems level change? Mm-hmm. So comparatively, as we're talking through American culture versus the Nordic culture, how have you seen that affect the adoption of systems level change, and how can we kind of frame that in the context of the US perspective?
I fear I'm talking too much, but I think that one was kind of directed to me.
You're Mr. Nordic, so I think you should talk.
Go ahead.
One big difference, and here I want to appeal and use this. So the United States we love competition for the sake of competition. And my father-in-law, I love him dearly. His name is Bill, and he's a hog farmer in South Dakota. And I'm a tall, skinny guy. He's this stocky sort of, and he loves competition. And he used to tee my wife Sarah and her sister Katie. They would have like little, construct sort of competitions between them that I actually would say I think he was overall a good father, but I don't think that was a very healthy thing. I think that there's sometimes a hyper level of competition that we have here in the United States that I think actually prevents us from cooperating in areas where it actually would be in our own self-interest to cooperate. And so this is something where I actually am trying to deviously appeal to this competition when I'm talking in American audiences about how, comparatively speaking, well the Nordics are doing. In a way, I'm kind of jabbing and saying, you're getting beat. You're getting beat, Americans. We could be living a better life. Parents in particular, there is a better way. There are systems that we could set up where you could actually be a more present parent, where you don't feel all these pressures and concerns and worries because certain things are alleviated and more efficiently taken care of else in other places. So I'm trying to appeal to that. And this is where I see a big difference because we are a hyper competitive environment. And in the Nordics context, they're taught about consensus building and cooperation at a much younger age and to work things out themselves. And so this is a difference. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I appeal to that difference to drive the change that I desire? And in part, I'm doing it by saying, America, we're getting beat. Don't we want to win at a better life? So I think there's a difference, but then how do we appeal to that?
I would add to that, Robert, and this is taken from one of the talks you did last year, and please let me know who said this because I am remiss in not remembering, where they said, we're talking about individualism in the United States. And speaking to that value that Americans hold so dear of like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you achieve what you achieve because you work hard. And how the Nordic region was saying, we are also equally as individualistic. We want the best for everything. And for us, that means having healthcare, having childcare. And so I think it's looking at what is the language that the culture is using. And in America, that is individualism, that is competition, as Robert's saying. And then how do you take this framework and put it in that language so it speaks to individuals? So you're not saying this is socialism and scaring half the country, but you're putting it in the language that they use and showing how that is in service of what they also hold true and dear and believe in.
And Saren, you raised such a good point here. And let me, if I could share a word that I want us to all own again. And that word is freedom. And if this individual, Isaiah Berlin, within this book here, describes there are two different kinds of freedom. There's negative freedom and there's positive freedom. And in the United States, we have a hyper allegiance to negative freedom. And what they look at the Nordics is positive freedom. And what are the differences in these freedoms? So negative freedom is, I don't want anybody to tell me I can't do something. I don't want anybody to tell me that I can't go outside without a mask on. I want to be able to walk outside with a mask on. And if you violate that, you're violating my negative freedom. Positive freedom is on the other side is, how do we actually enable people to realize their potentials? Positive freedom is providing things like access to education and things like this where folks can actually realize and fulfill themselves. And I see in the United States this idea of negative freedom. I want to grab back onto freedom and say, you know what? We're not as free as we think. We're not free of anxiety. We're not free of fear. We're not free of worrying about if our children are going to have a good life. That is inhibiting our freedom. And there are systems that we can put in place to ensure that more of us can feel greater freedom. And there's some real differences here. And Saren hits on a great point on individualism because the Nordics are every bit as individualistic as the United States. It's just they've come to realize that to achieve their greatest level of individual prosperity, rather than look at in the United States, we have a me society. I characterize the Nordics as a me, we, me. The only way that the me is going to benefit the most is if I think about the we. And that leads us to very different things like Helsinki's eliminated the homelessness population, not because they are more caring, loving people, but they said, I don't want to live in a city where there are a bunch of homeless folks. And this is something in my own self-interest. And so they've actually put efficient practices in place that actually end up being less costly in the city of Helsinki because there is a great economic cost, not to mention a moral cost, but a great economic cost in having homeless populations. But how do we come together as the we and figure out where can we put systems in place to achieve greater prosperity for the me? So freedom. I want us to get back to this idea of freedom and how I would suggest we are, the land of the free is a narrative for a few in power. But for the vast majority of us, we're not as free as what that narrative would tee us up to be or would say we should be.
Stephanos, I know you wrote something in the chat. Do you want to mute yourself and ask it, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Isaiah. Thank you, Robert. This is a fascinating conversation. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to join in from the beginning. But, I think the thing I struggle with is how do we all participate in a tangible way with that greater understanding of what's happening and what the dynamics are in front of us. Because I also come from Europe and I share some of that. I'm not coming from the Nordics, but I share some of that sentiment around identifying with a community as opposed to thinking about myself all the time. And I totally understand how different that the dynamics that creates on the individual level. But the thing I'm struggling with is, okay, so we are faced with what we're faced as the status quo in this country. What is what is something tangible and easy and feasible enough that we all can start engaging doing today to help move the needle? I mean, from your experience, I'm just interested in your perspective.
Thank you. I'll go back just to hammer it home, and I'd say find a policy matter that you care about deeply and use your power, whether you're a business leader or an individual, to drive it home. And I'm thinking very pragmatically. When I say paid parental leaves, the evidence is so sound that paid parental leaves pay for themselves, and they are super easy from a policy perspective. It's a matter of a cash transfer. Very, very easy. I'm not talking about building big infrastructure, but it can have immediate resonance. And so what I'm trying to do, every place that I have a little platform here and there, is to hammer that one home and make the economic rationale as well as the moral rationale for it, and appealing to parents. And I really think that parents cuts across all political lines, all colors. Many of us become parents. And then we have a common interest in our children. And how do we create a better life for our children? And I think that parents should bound together as a political coalition and affect some change in this country. So that's what I'm appealing. Find one policy matter that you care about and are going to commit yourself. And if you happen to have a forum through your business, that you use that forum to drive and champion that particular policy.
I would also add on that. Finish your thought, Robert, please.
I think it's important for us to talk about one policy, because the boogeyman in America is socialism. And socialism, when you ask somebody, if you start pressing, what do you mean by that? Are you talking about nationalizing all private property? Are you talking about removing markets from setting pricing mechanisms or quantities in a society? No, I'm not talking about that. So I think by getting specific about a specific policy measure, and I mean paid parental leaves for 8 weeks for all Americans, that then it removes this idea of socialism, because I actually think that word should be banned in America. We can't handle it. It's a boogeyman. It's an empty vessel that just brings a bunch of historical rhetoric with it. But Saren, I'm sorry I interrupted.
Oh, no, please. I was going to add, also highlight what Margot Alexander just put in the chat in terms of is to identify an organization, usually a nonprofit, that works on that issue and policy matter. Do not do it alone. There are people who are spending lots of time and money and resources on that policy issue. So spend your volunteer time, spend your dollars with that organization. There's power in numbers. I would also say, look at your city budgets. This is very nerdy, but all of us live in cities. All of us have city managers that are passing priorities of how cities are spending their money. Are you spending it primarily towards your police force? Are you spending it towards your libraries? Are you spending it towards your playgrounds, outdoor spaces? Are you spending it towards your schools? Where is that money going? If any of you have been to city council meetings, there's ample time for public comment. And so I encourage you to really take a look at the hyper local level, because those impacts get elevated very highly. And I think case in point, looking at where Stockton's come in the last few years and the great work Stockton's doing, and you can see just what impact cities can have in larger state national conversations.
So just one more quick add. I think within corporations, you can also just ask your public affairs team, if you're not already tied to that work, what they're focusing on in terms of lobbying and why. I've learned tons about tax legislation because I'm at Intuit, but also some other really unique areas that Intuit is getting involved, specifically because we're listening to employees. And I think maybe we underestimate the influence that, especially if you're in a leadership position at your organization, if you have something that you believe that the company should be more vocal about, it can often be a very great avenue. Is just working with your public affairs and your corporate affairs team.
We're towards the end here. There were so many amazing things that were unpacked and conversations that were had and stories that were shared. Thank you, Karen. Are there any more comments, ideas? You guys already know that Isaiah and I package all of these, the chat, the video, all of that will be sent to each of you who have joined today. But are there any comments or ideas that anybody wants to add to the conversation?
I'd like to say one thing to Robert. Robert, is one thing that you said earlier that I wholeheartedly believe, and when I talk to students, I bring that up just as a point of reference. You know, when you think about in America, the Fair Housing Act that was passed in the 40s, as a policy in terms of how it affected the system, is one of the biggest causes of disproportionate wealth in terms of minorities and whites. You know, from building a house, equity, people going to college, being able to do things like, and then kids looking at you like, well, my parents sent me to college. Why didn't your parents say? Well, because it was an apartment, with no equity, couldn't get a loan, all that, those types of things. So to me, that's one of the biggest ones.
Thank you for that, Troy. I agree completely. And admittedly, I'm only later in life learning about these things. And it's also where Sarah just mentioned getting to know what your the public affairs in your companies are doing. And an illuminating book by Robert Reich from a couple of years ago, Super Capitalism, he said, look at what your public affairs are doing in your company, and then look at what your CSR, corporate social responsibility folks are doing. And a lot of times they're advocating for different things. Public affairs might be lobbying to reduce taxes that you'd pay to your local communities to build parks. And the CSR team is saying, hey, let's go clean the parks in the weekends. And these kind of hypocrisies here. And that's what takes me to the level of, I think that I believe in organizations doing good, but in and of itself, it's not enough. We have to go up a level to the level of policy. And I think that you raise a really good point as to why, Troy.
Yeah, it's really good. One of the last things I would say, because we always look for actionable ways that we can not just have these great conversations, but walk away with a piece that we can actually do. And Robert, the one thing that amongst many that stuck out today is looking for each individual to look at where you come alive and really dive into that thing. This is the part where Isaiah and I come alive, and that's connecting people and setting the table for conversations like this. It doesn't seem like a lot, but just creating community and being able to present and share these resources and tools with each of you is a passion for both of us. This is where we come alive. Think about that part as to like where you come alive and be a part of that. And together, we always believe that we can change the world one ripple at a time is what Isaiah and I always say to each other, but it's true. And
just to add to that really quick, I think the other thing that stuck out, from Karen's point is, continue to ask the questions and continue asking why. And don't feel that you need to go on this journey alone. You have a community here, a community of thought partners, a community of professionals that you can bounce ideas back and forth. And you are always open to continue connecting. So don't go at the journey alone, and continue asking why and continue questioning the status quo.
That's really good. Okay, before we wrap up, I'd love our panelists to have one last, how do people get in touch with you? What are you doing next? Is there something that you want to give a humble brag about or let us know what you're doing? Robert, Saren, and Sarah, you guys have been amazing. But Saren, if you would like to start and just let people know where they can get in touch with you, if you want to put it in the chat, but also just to let people know.
Absolutely. I'm going to pop my LinkedIn in the chat. In full transparency, I just had my second kid a few months ago. So most of my work is getting back into the workforce right now and juggling 2 little ones. So not much going on other than catching up on work streams, but I would say a lot of what's happening at Haas specifically on the sustainability front is and working with companies thinking about things at a systemic level, as opposed to each company making an individual change. We're going to be having a lot rolling out on that in terms of cross-industry collaborations and where companies can work towards a goal larger than just an individual company. So more to come on that front.
Really good. Sarah?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've learned more from this group than I think you probably all have from me. I would love to continue the conversation. I'll put my email and my LinkedIn into the chat. I'm 36 weeks pregnant, so I am so excited in future weeks to go into baby carrying mode, but also more of a learning mode. So I know I'm personally interested in how corporations are applying smarter policies, and would love to continue the chat in that regard with any of you if you're interested in connecting.
That's really good. Thank you. Last but not least, Robert, you have been amazing. Please tell people about your book. Tell them how they can get a hold of you if they want to have a private chat, ask some questions. How can people stay in touch?
Oh, thank you. Rashawn and Isaiah, thank you so very much. And what you're building here and the community that you're fostering. I'm so impressed and so grateful to be able to be part of it in some way. And I want to thank Saren and Sarah. Thank you so much for stepping up and taking part here today. I shared my LinkedIn. Please connect. I tend to use LinkedIn, and if you send a message via the LinkedIn and would like to see a chapter from this book, I will happily share it. So it's more than just my parents and my sisters who have read it. And I also want to say a very special thank you to a wonderful human being who's here in Marco, Lindsay, and you're a special person. Thank you. Thanks everyone so much.
That's really good.
We really appreciate everybody. We'd be remiss if we didn't give a quick shout out to Miles Bianchi. He's been with us from the beginning, joined the community and helping us kind of run things today. So just want to give a special shout out to Miles and say thank you. To our panelists, to Robert, we really appreciate you joining today. It's been a fantastic conversation. I've learned so much, and I'm sure the community has as well. To wrap up, we just want to mention that, part of what we do is you'll get the recording of this. Robert will take the excerpt from your book and we'll add it to what everybody gets as well, if we're able to do that. We'll also share out a contact list that has everybody's profile pics, headshots, and LinkedIn, and we'll put that together in the next week and a half or so, and we'll get that out. We also want to invite everybody to join the Equity Matters community on LinkedIn. We share different bits of information. We want to keep the conversation going. And of course, as we mentioned, you're not on this journey alone. You have a group of folks from diverse backgrounds and geographies here, to be able to discuss this with and continue the conversation. So we welcome you to connect with us on LinkedIn, and we welcome you to connect with each other to continue building something great. We want to hear that you're working on some incredible things outside of this conversation. And, we look forward to amplifying the stories and the voices of everybody within the community. Rashonda?
So last but not least, we try so hard to create not just really good speakers like Robert and to think of great topics in order to continue the engagement and the growth for all of us. We send out annoying surveys that a lot of you are like, I'm ignoring that. That was a great event. Thank you so much. We love the surveys. That gives us data, information in order to get even better. Isaiah and I struggle really hard to make sure that each event is curated and done well. We do our homework, and it is a labor of love for both of us, but the surveys that we send are so powerful for us because it gives us information and insight. What time of day do you guys like to have this at? Like, we've kept it at this time because that has been a popular response. We make sure that each speaker gives talking points as to when and how we can all hold ourselves accountable, because that has been something that you guys have mentioned in the survey. We're going to send one out again
So please make sure that you actually give us feedback. We love that. So,
and just one last thing to add there. We typically don't do homework, but I think we'll do it on this survey going out. Robert, Saren, and Sarah mentioned that one of the best ways to get involved and focused on systems change is to figure out one policy that you can help pursue. And so in the survey, we're going to ask that question. And hopefully, by the time we get that survey out, everybody would have thought about one way they would love to change. So on behalf of the Equity Matters team and community, we really want to thank you for joining today.